quite a pleasure to be here today to talk about this important topic. The issue of immigration and terrorism and criminality, as Denzel said, is a very important one for understanding not only public opinion on this issue, but also just for understanding what the true nature of these types of dangers actually are. So we did a lot of original research at Cato, published it recently, so I'm going to run through what some of those findings are because they're probably going to be pretty surprising to most people. So what I do is I write about the risk of dying, risk of terrorism and the risk of crime in the United States. So the risk of being murdered in a terrorist attack, especially by a foreign-born terrorist, is one concern, while the incarceration rates of immigrants by their legal status is also important. This includes both lawful immigrants and unlawful immigrants. So in order to calculate the risk of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a native-born American, I had to take a look at several different issues. One is the number of foreign-born terrorists who were either attacked on U.S. soil or planning an attack on U.S. soil, where they are from, the visas they used, as well as the total number of visas issued to people in those countries, and the number of people they killed in those attacks. Turns out, when you take a look at that, tourists are, of course, the deadliest group. That's because 18 out of the 19 9/11 hijackers entered on terrorism, on tourist visas. So when we break down these numbers, we took a look at 1975 through 2015. We found a total of 154 foreign-born terrorists who either committed an attack on U.S. soil or who planned an attack on U.S. soil and were captured beforehand. They killed a total of 3,024 people in those attacks during that time period. 98.6% of those are on 9/11 entirely. So 9/11 dominates this example as it dominates all terrorism. Just as a side note, 9/11 is, depending on how you measure it, between 4 and 9 times deadlier than the next deadliest terrorist attack in world history. Now, during this time period, a total of 3,432 Americans were murdered on U.S. soil by all terrorists. That includes native-born terrorists here in the United States. 24 of those since 9/11 to the end of 2015. So it's important to note that 88% of all deaths by terrorism on U.S. soil during this time period were caused by foreign-born terrorists, but that's because 9/11 dominates. You cut out 9/11 from this, the rate, the percentage of people killed by foreign-born terrorists is basically the same as it is the percentage of the population. The definition of terrorism that I'm using is that is compiled by the Global Terrorism Database at the University of Maryland, the RAND Corporation, and numerous other sources, which is politically motivated violence. So violence motivated for political ends and political of doing so that's committed by non-state actors. So when I crunch all these numbers, I take a look at the number of deaths committed by foreign-born terrorists, and then I take a look at the way that they entered the United States, either the visa or the non-visa that they had when they entered the United States, because that's when the security checks happen, if they happen at all. So from 1975 to the end of 2015, one person who entered the United States unlawfully was killed by a terrorist who entered the United States unlawfully during that time period, which means that the annual chance of being murdered by a foreign-born terrorist who entered illegally is about 1 in 10.9 billion per year during that time period. For a lawful permanent resident, it's about 1 in 1 billion per year. For an asylum seeker, it's about 1 in 2.7 billion per year. And a tourist, it's about 1 in 3.8 million per year. That's because, again, 18 out of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were tourists. They were the deadliest. Now, I want you to notice this number for refugees here in the middle. Refugees are the focus of a lot of fear about terrorism committed by foreigners. However, during this time period, there were essentially three refugees people who entered on a refugee visa or through a refugee system into the United States, who committed terrorist attacks that murdered a total of 3 people during that time period, which means the annual chance of being murdered by a refugee terrorist on U.S. soil is about 1 in 3.64 billion per year. That's a very, very small and minor chance. So taking a look at the entries per visa category, these are the number of people who've entered the United States on these visas. We see there's hundreds of millions who have come in on tourist visas, visa waiver program, 400 million. Tourists, about 658 million. Unlawfully entered, about 26 million. Students, 24 million. And it goes down the line. On the right-hand side, it shows the number of visas per tourist that are answered, that enter. And the number of visas shows that it's pretty simple. I just got a question about why I use the term illegal immigrant instead of undocumented. That's because I'm trying to actually convince people who disagree with me. And when I talk to conservatives who disagree with me on this issue, I try to use their language because I need to use their language in order to talk to them. I find that when I use the term undocumented, it makes them turn off and go somewhere else. I prefer the term undocumented myself, but it's entirely due to try to convince people who disagree with me. I'm sorry if that offends you, but I'm more in the business of trying to convince people than trying to look out for people's feelings. The next set of information I took a look at is the incarceration rate. That is the rate at which people are incarcerated in the United States based on their immigration status. Took a look at data in 2014 from the U.S. Census. We took a look at a residual statistical technique. We found out that native-born Americans are incarcerated at a rate of about 1.53%. Unlawful or illegal immigrants are incarcerated at 0.85%, and legal immigrants are incarcerated at a rate of 0.47%. Now, what's interesting is that this includes, of course, in the illegal and unlawful immigrant category, that includes people who are in immigrant detention at the border. When you actually cut out people who are in immigrant detention or the only offense they've actually committed is an immigration offense, the unlawful immigrant or illegal immigrant category incarceration rate is about 0.5%, which is equal to that of legal immigrants. So the stereotype that unlawful or illegal immigrants are actually more crime prone is just false. It's not true at all. It's about equal to that of lawful immigrants in the United States. Now, the conclusion of all this research is that there's a very small risk of dying from foreign-born terrorism on U.S. soil. From 1975 to 2015, the number of murders committed entirely during that time period are 768,000. Foreign-born terrorists are responsible for about 0.4% of that. About 255 times as likely to be murdered in a normal homicide per year as you are to be killed in a terrorist attack committed by foreigners. What's interesting is when you take a look at refugees, sort of a subset of this, you are 255,000 times more likely to be killed in a non-terrorist homicide than you are to be killed by a refugee on U.S. soil. Immigrants also have lower incarceration rates than natives, regardless of their legal status. So I think just taking a look purely at the data and the data that exists, it's very easy to say that your chance of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a foreigner is very small. It's much smaller than almost any other risk that Americans face. And immigrants of every legal status are much less likely to be incarcerated than native-born Americans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And before you go, I just wanted to ask you one question. Would you mind coming back on cam? And the question is, a book came out within the past 12 months about immigrants and crime. I think it was called Adios America. How do you respond to questions about your data when you have people on the right who seem to have data of their own? Alex, are you there?
So yeah, that book, Adios America, was written by Ann Coulter, and she makes a lot of claims that are simply false in that book. She claims there's really no data supporting or coming to the conclusion that unlawful immigrants are more or less likely to commit crimes. That's simply false. We can use the census to take a look through a specific technique to take a look at unlawful immigrants who are incarcerated. But she also goes on to say a lot of nutty things in her book about how there's really no good evidence anyway about immigrants and crime. That's simply not true. Whoever wrote that section of her book, whether it was her or somebody else, did not do their research very well. The other side really doesn't have good data on this. And what's interesting is we take a look at the peer-reviewed evidence on this. It's pretty much agreed upon by everybody, including immigration restrictionists, with the exception of Ann Coulter, that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes. They just disagree about whether unlawful immigrants are more likely to. And that's why my research on this is so unique, is that it actually tries to answer that specific question.